Good evening, everyone. This is Christopher Urbane hosting this event on behalf of the ASQ Inspection Division this evening. I want to present tonight's topic, which is technical presentation skills for the multicultural enterprise. First, I'd like everybody to know that this event is being recorded. It will be posted at a later date along with the presentation. If anybody needs the presentation right away, you can always email me. An automated email will go out with RUs and my contact information at the end of the presentation. That will serve as your receipt for attending the event. I'd like to present David Otta. I actually have the great pleasure of knowing Mr. Otta personally. He taught a FEMA class at Volvo, where we both are employed. Dave has a great background, both with the ASQ and within the reliability division, and working as an engineer in multiple trades. Dave's history spans aerospace, instrument development, medical device, heavy equipment, and energy generation industry. So this is going to be an interesting presentation tonight. If you have any questions, you can type them into the chat box. And if there's something important, we can get to it right away, or we will answer all questions in the order that they are typed in at the end of the presentation. With no further ado, I'd like to present David Otta.
Thanks, and welcome to everyone who's joined at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So today's topic, technical presentation skills for the multicultural enterprise. Certainly everybody can appreciate that, because I don't think you could probably find a company that doesn't have some kind of a connection that would be considered significant in multicultural. Either suppliers are offshore, or even within the geographical United States, we've got multicultural challenges. So this presentation is going to really focus on technical presentation skills. And there are different facets of that. There's, public speaking skills, persuasion, or statistics, how to render data, maybe how to negotiate. We're not necessarily going to cover all that in any depth. We're going to just talk about technical presentation skills. And when I Google up to look at what other people are doing with respect to multicultural technical presentation skills, I don't see a lot of stuff there, which is, to me, a significant oversight by those people who are putting together different approaches to presentation skills. So we'll explore some of the more meaningful aspects of that. Hit a prologue here, which basically lays out the baseline. We're faced with this predicament when we can't see our audience. They're not visible, they can't see us, we can't see them, so we're sacrificing the body language, which accounts for a good percentage of the communication. The only thing we have is our voice and our presentation materials by which we're going to communicate to them. And if it's technical presentation skill, it's most likely one way. We're not looking to influence or negotiate, we're looking to communicate some goal or truth or objective. So that was the original nature of the presentation. And the three challenges we are faced with is this universal effective practices for people in general. So we'd like to catalog those. What are those that apply to everyone? And many years ago when I started taking on public speaking skills, I joined Toastmasters International. And I was really surprised, because I was playing on a multicultural soccer team, and we had players from all over the world. And what struck me is what I discovered as I started to engage in this technical presentations and public speaking skills, that fear of public speaking was really universal globally. I worked with people from Indonesia, Korea, Vietnam, UK, and they all had the same fear of public speaking, which I thought was kind of unique. I wouldn't have thought that it would have been so geographically distributed in such a normal fashion. So what we do know about human beings in general is that there's this universal effective practices just for human beings in general. So we'll list those so we can take advantage of those. We also need to consider the geography of thought. A little slide or two on that. People think differently in different parts of the world, and so we'll talk about that. And then, of course, there's the change-up. When you go to another part of the world and work there as other people come and work here, there's some interesting things that happen there when it comes to assimilation. Then we'll talk about persuading the audience, which is an important part, because even if we're doing a technical presentation skill and they're all facts and the data is objective enough, we still have to persuade them. Otherwise, people can take a defensive position. We'll talk about that a little bit, the emotional ability of individuals to resign from what would be considered to be a black and white case. So there are some bonus topics. We'll talk about abiding by biases, heuristics, beliefs, prejudices, etc. These all play a significant part in the way that we make decisions. And the decisions that are being made here by your audience are whether or not they're finding you credible, whether they find the data credible, whether they accept it. So they're making these decisions, maybe some of them on a subconscious level. Did they like the presentation, the way it was put to them? Could be the color scheme, could be the size of the text, the font. And then they're also making decisions based on the interaction, the auditory, and maybe even the pace. So I continued with this prologue a little bit, just to expand. It was a thought process I was going through, basically for myself, saying, in this global economy, we can't avoid it. We have these interactions and dependencies that are just going to cross all kinds of boundaries, cultural, geographical, and are now just commonplace. They're everywhere. I work with people that work in the same state, same city I do, and yet they have dependencies on people in other parts of the globe. There are a lot of subtleties that need to be considered with regard to how these communication paths start and how they're sustained, and the information and the data that are shared and how they're shared. So the proverbial landscape is termed open context. This might be a term that you're not familiar with, as it is impossible to anticipate all the possible scenarios involved across businesses, industries, disciplines, you name it, ages, generations. Yet, even in this open context space, we can still find some good guidance when it comes to commonality. It covers the vast majority of the situations that can be proper. And that goes to that second point that I talked about earlier when we said that there are, or the first point was universal effective practices for people in general. Now, this open context, I should probably say a few more words about that. When we talk about open context, we're taking the boundaries off. We're saying that there's no holds barred, that there are some unknown variables here, and there are some unknown unknowables. There are some things that are going to present themselves if we discussed it openly for a while that I hadn't thought of. There will be some things that will be thought of on my part that you haven't thought of, and we'll expand the context radically. So this open context basically says that we're not putting a boundary on it. So we're allowing all things to come into focus. So I have an agenda, in light of the fact that we're all likely Western educated and I can't see, and we don't have, I don't have the ability or the luxury to be able to run a poll. Otherwise, I would be asking you where you're from geographically and where are you now. So you might be from Vietnam and maybe you're living in the U.S., or maybe you're from Australia and you're working in the U.K. I don't know. But there's significance to that. So we'll talk about structure. The structure of the presentation is going to play a big part in how effective you're going to be in communicating. And then we'll just talk about common effective practices. And these common effective practices, for the most part, should be transcontextual and transcultural. So I use the terminology transcontextual efficacy, and I'll explain that a little bit, and then transcultural normativity. You start to get a sense that basically this is trying to sum up to say that it doesn't matter where you are or who you're with, you should be able to take advantage of these common effective practices. And then we'll talk about the geography of thought, and then we'll talk about persuasion. Because for the most part, I think that it's highly arguable that every presentation is a persuasive presentation. Doesn't matter how you're doing it. You're going to persuade your audience one way or another. And we'll talk about negotiation too when the occasion requires a little bit of give and take. So there may be some, even as a facilitator presenting what you would consider to be an open and closed case, black and white, it is or it isn't, you may still find that there's an opportunity for negotiation with your audience in order to bring them into harmony with your thought process. So the structure, you know, as trivial as it seems, you would think that, you know, we already know what the structure is. It's a review of how the presentation is structured. And so we'll cover it here. Identification of the target audience. That's an important part of the process. Sit down and think about who it is that's in your audience. Who's the target? You're not going to catch everybody. It's very unlikely. The idea here would be the target audience is probably going to be a subset of the audience. If you're doing, say, a technical presentation, maybe you're doing warranty recovery, the data speaks for itself. You got 30 years of historical data. You got a lot of good markers. You have proven algorithms that you're running, and it looks to you like it's just black and white. Nonetheless, identification of your target audience then are going to be the people who have resources and control or power to make decisions in order to help you achieve the greater goal. So you want to take that into consideration, because in the persuasive presentation, you're probably going to be playing to that target audience. And in some cases, you may play to an individual who has authority and power in the presentation. Every presentation should have an opening. I sit in a lot of presentations where you think they're just shooting from the hip. It's like, there's no agenda. I'm not too sure what we're going to cover. It just kind of happens. That's probably not a good way to start a technical presentation. You might have a formal opening. You want to list your main objectives. Let your audience know where you're going, what the objectives are, and then give them 2 or 3 compelling reasons why they should know or do what you're asking them to know or do. And once you use that as a framework to develop your presentation, you'll find it's much easier to craft it. So when we're talking about motivation too, and I see the motivation to pay attention to this, what might be considered a trivial structure, is that I do a lot of presentations for the ASQ. I'm the executive producer for the ASQ Reliability and Risk Division's webinar series, which has been running for quite a few years now. And I see many speakers that are hosted there still don't follow this approach. Some of them just come out of the gate, arms waving, and for the most part, I think they might lose their audience, or in some cases, they're trying to further a covert agenda. I mean, it's okay to write down what your objective is, and it's okay to write down what your covert objective is. That's okay for your crafting of the presentation, for the structure. You want to achieve both of those goals. And maybe an example of that would be the overt agenda, or the overt objective of the presentation might be to share the sales data. And the covert agenda might be to establish yourself as a credible authority in that area. So you're going to craft your presentation to consider both of those. Every step of the way, you're going to be asking the question, am I meeting my overt objective? Am I sharing the data in such a way that they'll get it? And at the same time, the covert agenda to say, am I presenting myself in such a way that people will garner respect for me and draw on my knowledge in the future? So it's okay to do that. I don't give you any templates to do that, but certainly it makes sense to write down what the achievement, what is it you're trying to achieve with respect to the audience, and whatever your personal goals are. So this is also going to bring into focus this pace of the delivery. This is going to have significant impact when we're talking about global multicultural. Some people speak slower, some people internalize slower, some people are fast. I'm a pretty fast presenter myself. I used to think that was cute when I started a technical presentation and I made the audience aware of the fact that they could think twice as fast as I could talk. That wasn't always so well received. But it's true. Physiologically, you can think twice as fast as a presenter can pump material out, no matter how fast they pump it out. The question is, do you want to? Are you ready for it? Are you braced for it? Is that your normal intake? Is that the pace that you pursue regularly? We look at the way people speak foreign languages, and we see that Spanish people, for instance, speak really fast, considering what we speak. When I try to study Spanish, and when I hear Spanish people talking, it's like, whoa, pump the brake. I'm not sure if that's one word or 3 words. It's too quick for me. So you take that into consideration, too, for your multicultural global audience, that maybe they need to have a slower pace to be able to internalize properly. So the structure basically follows an old adage, which basically says, tell them what you're going to tell them, put an agenda out there, give them some objectives, tell them, and then tell them what you just told them. The reason we do that is because we want to make sure that the objectives of your presentation is met. In some cases, if we just look at some alternative types of presentations, where we may be at a conference, or maybe you're doing a team presentation or something, you lay out the objectives and say, here are my goals and objectives for this presentation. I'm going to share some effective practices for doing WIBO analysis, and then you share those, and then at the end you're going to tell them, now I've met my objective. I've shared with you these specific topics, which will enable you to be able to perform these tasks or make these calculations or develop these graphs. Don't leave it up to them to make a determination, because maybe they weren't thinking, maybe they were being dispatched. It was kind of funny because I'd done some global presentations where I did have videos into the conference room, so we had video conferencing. And even though those people knew that I could see them on camera, they were still doing things that were unacceptable on their cell phones, turning away from the presentation, having side conversations with their mics muted. And so even when you have a video conference, you still have things like that happening. So at the end of your presentation, because it's a technical presentation, you're going to state your objectives, and then at the end, you're going to show them how you met those objectives so that they don't walk away with an open-ended agenda. Because there's a good chance that if it's technical, they're going to forget the majority, 80% of it probably in less than 2 hours after they walk away. And they may come to a different conclusion when somebody asks them, or their boss asks them, well, hey, how was that presentation that you saw on WIBO analysis? To go, yeah, well, it didn't meet all the objectives. Don't let that go. Plant that seed so that when they walk away, they're going to be walking away with those words ringing in their ears. We met the objectives. So what are the objectives being pursued, and how does your presentation meet those objectives? Now, common effective practices, this is just good for everybody globally everywhere. I don't call them best practices. I once chaired an ad hoc committee for the ASQ, which was titled Best Practices. I was working with a lot of global technical leaders, and the first thing they gave me was they shot me up for that. See, there is no such thing as a best practice. If it's a best practice, then there could be nothing better, and that just sort of takes the fire out of continuous improvement. I agree with it. So we changed the ad hoc committee title to effective practices. Some are more effective than others. So here are some effective practices that we can use in technical presentations. The objective of the presentation approach should be transcontextual, should be structured and delivered in such a way, developed to ensure that it's independent of the context. In other words, it doesn't matter what the context is. If the material content is an enabler to realize the objective of the presentation, what the audience is being asked to do or no. So when we talk about transcontextual efficacy, it wouldn't matter if we were doing warranty analysis, and it wouldn't matter if we were doing a data review, or if we were giving a summary report of the latest continuous improvement efforts across the plant, or if we were doing a summary of our performance appraisal objectives being met, whatever those are, should be transcontextual. And then transcultural, normal. So the presentation materials need to be free from any potential cultural biases, slang, metaphors, analogies, and that another culture may not be able to readily interpret. And we take that for granted. I see it all the time when we do a lot of intercultural, geographically dispersed presentations where we draw people from all over the world. And I see the use of slang and local tribal verbiage being used where it's just inappropriate and people don't get it. I became acutely aware of it when I had put together a workshop. I was in Hameln, Germany. I had people from around the globe sitting with me as I prepared them for the Certified Reliability Engineer exam for the ASQ to get their certification. And it came to me in spades that when I was talking and I was using words, people from different cultural backgrounds were saying, I have no idea what that word means. And if I translate it into my language, it has multiple meanings. So we have to take that into consideration. Be careful of the words that you choose. Objectives of the presentation, content. What is the audience being asked to do? You should be aware of that. Do they need to know something in order to be able to do something? Or maybe they just need to know it or just do it? That's going to be the basis of your agenda. So for the context, if the objectives of the presentations are to do something like, say, share survey results, it should be done in such a way that anyone could understand it and not have to be familiar with how to structure a survey or how to report a survey. Or if it's financial, they don't need to be a financial wizard. Or if it's got anything to do with healthcare, then they don't need to be a medical professional. They don't need to be a manufacturing line operator or something to understand that. And then, of course, normativity, maybe a couple more words on normativity to say that even if the presentation is on the top of something like knowing how to motivate workers in a particular country that has strong cultural mores, the presentation should be structured in such a way that anybody can take advantage of the points that are being shared. They can absorb it and effectively apply the approach. So here are some things that you should do and things you shouldn't do, common effective practices. Here are things that you should do. Save the questions for the end because there's a good chance that you've been given a slot of time. So if you have a timed presentation and if you're rehearsing it, which you should do, and you know when your end time is going to be, and you need to make sure that you don't overrun your end time because you're going to lose content. When we prep presenters for conferences, we're always telling them that they need to be able to cut to the chase in the event that something happens in the room. They lose the lights, they lose the mic, audio, video goes out, whatever. Somebody comes storming through the door, disrupts the presentation. Whatever that is, the presenter should be aware of that, and he should have plan B to say that given that interruption, given that I lost 10 minutes on my presentation, how am I going to conclude? You always want to be able to get to that summary slide and that objective slide to say, here were the objectives, here's the ones that I met. And if there was a disruption, maybe they weren't all met. So you want to be aware of that. And so saving the questions to the end is just a good idea because a lot of times questions during a presentation are just going to derail the timing. I just saw that in the presentation that we hosted for the ASQ Reliability and Risk Division where I had two presenters and I'm telling them, you guys need to rehearse this. It's got to be handoffs back and forth, do the timing. They go, no, we've done this before. We know how to do it. And I said, well, do you want to take questions during the presentation or do you want to hold them to the end? I said, I advise holding them to the end. No. If it looks relevant to the slide we're talking about, let's bring it on. Well, needless to say, they were about 10 minutes over. They didn't get, and at the end they had to rush through the presentation. It's so easy to go off track. So for a timed presentation, you're going to set the context, you're going to set the rules. So you're basically going to say, I appreciate that you have questions. Many of those questions may very well be answered on slides that you're going to see later on. So I'm not going to take questions in the flow. We'll save them to the end. If it's a hosted presentation, you can always just dispatch the host and say, hey, collect the questions for me And if they're similar questions, put them together so don't have to answer 50 questions. Maybe we can narrow it down to 30. Anticipate challenges and address them before anyone else has a chance to, because if you allow them to challenge, at the end, it's going to derail you from making a credible, I met my objective statement. So if you can see that there are going to be foreseeable challenges, then address them right away. Anticipate those, and then address them. Let the words come out of your mouth instead of somebody else's mouth, because if they come out of somebody else's mouth, that allows them to take a defensive position, and we know that doesn't work well. We talk about persuasion, and maybe this is a good time to interject that, because we're kind of talking about that defensive position that you don't want your audience or any member of your audience to be in. When I was doing some presentations on decision theory and neuroplasticity and emotions, and I was testing the material on my wife, and I told her, you know, I saw this data, which really was compelling, and I told her, you know, I'm pretty good with numbers. I'm a certified reliability engineer, statistician, do a lot of work with numbers and electrical engineer. Formulas come out of my ears. So I said, I got a pretty good grasp of that, but I said, I saw this presentation, and for the life of me, I couldn't reconcile with the data. So curious enough, she asked me, well, what was it? And I said, well, it was a study that they had done, which was unarguable, that children with larger feet made better decisions than children with smaller feet. She looked at me funny, and she said, no, I don't believe that. And I said, well, think about it, sweetheart. A 10-year-old has larger feet than a 5-year-old, and so a 10-year-old is going to make better decisions than a 5-year-old would. And to my surprise, she folded her arms, sat back, gave me a dirty look, and said, I still don't believe it. So you can see, once those emotions get triggered, she went irrational. There was no more rationality in the conversation after that. So needless to say now that I don't get to test my material on her anymore. I pose a question to her, she gives me the jaundiced eye. It's like, yeah, you're setting me up. I'm not going to have that conversation. So when it comes to that persuasion and in the questions and the defensive position and the challenges, you know, be cognizant of that. Try to anticipate it. Always use a you're right followed by and. We don't want to put the word but into a presentation. It doesn't work very well. We take the word but out. I mean, it's like somebody, your significant other comes into the room and says, you know, I just bought this outfit. Do you think it makes me look large? And there's like there's not that there's any right answer to that, but you certainly don't want to say, yeah, you're right, you look large, but you certainly don't want to say but. You want to say, oh, no, you look beautiful, but, because that but negates everything in front of the sentence. So if somebody does raise a question that challenges or that questions, you can say, yeah, you're right. You know, that's a good question. I recognize that. I can validate it. And then follow it. Instead of saying but, say and. I've also come into knowledge of this or into a greater awareness of this, and I've included some other data which maybe you haven't seen, and so it takes on a new light for me. That's just a good way to approach it. Then simplify the language. Maybe to the extent that even a 7-year-old would be able to get it. You know, keep the language at that simplistic level. Because as I mentioned earlier, people from different cultural backgrounds and different geographies think a lot different than we do, and the words that they use can be translated into a number of different words. Some words don't even have translations. So avoid the slang, the acronyms, the mnemonics, the techno talk, the tribal terminology. Get rid of that stuff. You know, screen it. Maybe you need to have somebody look at your presentation material to make sure that you didn't miss one. And then use the rule of sevens. It's not bad. You know, it's basically from behavioral sciences says 7 lines, 7 words per line. That's good. You know, you can stray from that a little bit. This slide strays from that a little bit. But you have to remember that out of that behavioral study, people tended to remember those 7. So they did this study over and over again where they just threw a bunch of objects out on the table, and then they took them away, and then they started bringing them back one by one to see, well, how many of these do you remember seeing on the table, and they threw them all down. And the answer was, on average, 7. So keep that in mind, that people are typically wired to remember about 7 things. So 7 lines, 7 words per line, not a bad rule. And then it keeps your presentation concise. And then content adds support to the presentation. And if it's not adding to the presentation, it's probably subtracting from it. So you want to make sure that you take that into consideration. And then, of course, keep it genderless. When we were in Toastmasters, we used to have one presenter introduce the other presenter. And a lot of times in the workshops that I did, which were at international conferences, I would invite somebody up and then I would give them a sheet of an introduction with a name on it that somebody else in the audience wrote. And we would just mix them up, pass them around. And they would say, well, I'd like to introduce Mrs. or Mr., only to find out that they had the gender wrong, because there was no way that they could have interpreted the name correctly. So you don't want to do that, and you don't want to offend people. So keep it genderless. Stay on the safe side. And given that we're specifying this as being open context, this means the audience could be anyone, and the content could be anything. So some more common effective practices, where we have on here now the list of don't do, things don't do. Don't use obscure references that a general global audience might not be familiar with. And we have a lot of slang in our day-to-day conversations, which are probably hyped by the media. We don't want to use that slang, like POTUS and SCOTUS. It's like, well, you don't want to use that in the presentation. People are not going to get it from other parts of the globe. So we want to use those obscure references. And if you're going to use them, then you need to explain what they are. And then, of course, if you're explaining what your reference is, then you're probably detracting from the content that you're trying to deliver, the objective you're trying to make, the do or no aspect of the presentation. We also say don't attempt to use humor, because that's probably going to be a mistake. When we see humor being used, a lot of times offenses can be taken, and appropriately so. And sometimes stuff just comes off the wall. You won't even see it. When I was doing presentation skills public speaking, and I had an audience, and it was a long time ago, I was in upstate New York, and I did a presentation, and I was talking about humor itself, and saying that it's probably not a good idea to use humor in a presentation unless it's persuasive and you know your audience very well. I used an example there, and I said, I think it was Mark Twain who said that humor in a presentation, if I can remember the quote, trying to instill humor in a presentation is much like having a baby, easy to conceive but hard to deliver. I did not realize, but after that presentation, I couldn't see it in the audience. I didn't read the faces. It didn't appear to me that way. But after I left that room, I was approached by the host, who told me that I offended somebody in the audience by using that humor. And I thought it was relatively benign. It wasn't. Somebody took offense with it for some reason. Don't ask rhetorical questions, because if you do, people will answer them, and you don't want to do that. Especially if it's a live audience and you're doing that as live and you ask a rhetorical question and somebody blurts out an answer, that could be embarrassing. Not to mention you're going to have to explain it. It's going to detract from your timing. Somebody else may take it on another tangent. Avoid it. Don't use busy slides, graphs, data tables. I see this all the time where people splash up these big tables. If you're going to do that, it's okay to say, I want you to see the enormity of the data that I've had to go through in order to get this technical presentation distilled down to a couple of takeaways. It's okay to flash that up, but don't expect anyone's going to try to make sense of it. You should, within that slide, you should zoom right to the important parts of it, or go to the next slide that highlights the data that you've summed up on that slide. And then you can always let them have it as handout so they can peruse it later at their own discretion. Don't forget to practice your presentation. It's important, because you'll forget things that you put in there. A lot of times your speaker notes will be, 1 or 2 words, and then you get into your presentation, you'll look at it, and you'll go blind. And then before you know it, you're scratching your head and standing there voiceless. You don't want to do that. Even on these presentations where you're removed once from the audience, and you think, well, I could have notes all over the table. I have all kinds of references I could have. It's not going to help you. You're just going to end up getting lost in your notes. Don't apologize for anything in the presentation or any part of the delivery of it. So if you drop your pencil, or if you drop the mic, or if the screen goes blank, or if you press the wrong button and you end up ending the presentation and the host has to come and help you find your way back in, or you shut down the Skype, don't apologize for it. Just keep on going. You might even just smile at it and say, you know, expect the unexpected, then move on. And then don't make any assumptions about the culture that you're dealing with or the stereotypes, because you don't know where they are with it. You might be presenting to, say, predominantly Australian audience, and they have culture. Maybe a Chinese audience would be more appropriate. So let's say you're doing a presentation to a Chinese audience, and you're making the assumption that they're all Chinese and they're all heavily embedded in the culture. That's not necessarily true. They may have been working in a highly Western normalized context. In other words, they've been working with Western engineers all day long, every day, and they just happen to be in this meeting. They have assimilated into a Western cultural thought process. It's just part of the way your brain works. We assimilate quickly. And so they're not going to be categorized as being immersed to the extent in the Chinese culture as you would think. So again, we go back to our common effective practices, the do's, so that we can make sure that we're giving everybody what they need and avoiding these things that are in the don't. Let's talk about geography of thought. So when we can consider this aquarium, I lost the word, but when we consider this aquarium, for instance, the first statement that would come back by someone who was indoctrinated in the Western way of thinking, Aristotle and syllogistic language and thought processes, comes right out of Aristotle and Plato. Those types of people usually refer to the large fish in the foreground. It's the big thing. It's the most important thing in the picture, or at least that they feel it is. So they would say something like, there was what looked like a large goldfish, and it was swimming to the left. They feel that's the most important thing in that picture. So the first statement by someone who's coming from the Eastern tradition of learning and cultural immersion would probably refer to the background elements. They might say something like, there are obviously plants, a castle, some natural formations, two fish swimming. So the Eastern cultural viewer will make a lot more assessments about what they're seeing. They take in the holistic view. They take in the background aspects. So you get a lot more feedback from somebody who takes in a holistic view. And they also have this idea of relationships as opposed to categories. So we need to take that into consideration when we're putting up graphics or when we're trying to communicate something. And so they may say something like, a big fish swam past some given seaweed because there's a relationship there between the fish and the seaweed. The Westerners' response to contradictions are by polarizing their beliefs, whereas somebody in the Eastern tradition, like a Chinese person, might respond by moderating their beliefs. And in still some studies that were done further along the way, researchers found that when making predictions about how people in general could be expected to behave in given situation, Koreans were much more likely than Americans, or Eastern versus Western, to cite situational factors rather than personality characteristics as reasons for someone's behavior. So they're taking into consideration a much bigger picture than we would. So the bottom line there, specifically, the Western style of thought is characterized by embodying the value of individual distinctiveness or independence. Yet in the Eastern style of thought, they embody the value of harmonious social relations or interdependence. Now, those of you on the statistics side who are familiar with TQM will probably know that TPM, which was total productive maintenance, was an aspect of that. And I think the first book that came, TPM, that came out of Japan was an absolute utter failure, and TQM suffered also. Because what happened was people went there and observed the practices that were being practiced in that immersed culture, and then they just tried to bring it into the Western way of thought and say, that's all we need to do is this, is do what we saw them do, but they didn't have the same value system, and so it didn't work. So then their books were rewritten, and then it was TPM for a Western plant, or TPM for a Western implementation, as opposed to just TPM, total productive maintenance, or TQM, total quality management. They had to make these adjustments because it just can't plug and play. It just doesn't work like that. So your presentation should strive to integrate these elements, either directly or implicitly. Also know that when working in a foreign country, people assimilate really quickly. So if you're looking at your audience and thinking, well, they all look like Western guys, they all speak like they were from my home state, that doesn't necessarily mean. They may be just traveling back from a foreign country, and they've been assimilated in that, and it takes a while to get out of that and re-assimilate into the new culture. Here we're talking about differing perspectives. So, and I ask this question of my audiences quite frequently when I'm doing decision theory or problem solving. It seems to apply in just about everything. Say, which of these two go together, banana, monkey, or panda? And people throw their hands up or blurt stuff out and go, it's a banana monkey. And some people go, no, it's monkey panda. And it's not very long. You get 5 or 6 responses, and you can make a conclusion right away. Say, people that are putting the monkey and the panda together are putting together what's known as a category. These are animals. They're putting them together. Bananas are fruit. Doesn't fit in that category. It's a very Western thought process. We love to put things in categories. But yet Eastern discipline thought processes would put the monkey together with the banana because there's a relationship there. So they're focusing on the relationship. And if you're doing a presentation, you have to take into consideration that the things that you're trying to stitch together in that presentation have to have both elements. They have to be categorically significant, and also you have to show the relationship so that everybody gets it. So I put some words in here. Focus on the predominant characteristics such as relationships, harmony, submission to authority. Cannot be reasonably assumed given your audience. And then setting ground rules as a means of establishing a shared viewpoint is not a bad idea. I mean, if you're in a position where you think that setting that context, that synthesized cultural element, you might just say, we're going to look at this material as if we were all Western engineers. And then people can easily make that transition because Eastern or Korean or Vietnamese or Chinese engineer has undoubtedly worked with Western engineers, and he knows what they're like and how they think, and so he can assimilate into that thought process. He can take that viewpoint, and he can appreciate the perspective. So you can set a ground rule like that. So here, setting context, a couple of more notes about that. We want to make sure that we take the appropriate response, because the context could be that maybe we're just doing a report out. We're not going to have any questions at all. It's a one-way communication. So we're basically going to say there are not going to be any questions at the end. This is just a report out. We see that now with this COVID thing, and businesses are responding. So you might have reports at work where they're just telling you. They're just saying, here it is. You're not coming to work tomorrow because the joint's closed. We locked the doors. So you're going to have to work from home. They're just telling you. They're not going to say, well, any questions? They're just going to say, here's how it's going to play. It's one-way communication. And we see that from our government telling us what we're going to do and what we're not going to do. And so you could have another report out where you're going to answer any questions at the end just for clarification. You're not taking any deliberation or collaboration. You're just going to take questions for clarification. Or you might have a report out where you're expecting feedback, and it can change the results of the decisions that are being made during that report out. You can say all the data points in one direction, but hey, at the end, if you can throw a monkey wrench into that makes sense, then we'll take that into consideration. You're setting the context by telling your audience this is what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. It could be an initial report, which, further guidance is being anticipated by the audience. You're hoping they're going to pose questions and make comments at the end because there's no result yet. So some points to consider. Keep people out of the report. Focus on the objectives. You don't want to say, well, the vice president of design and development says, or the chief financial officer says. You want to keep those people out. So we don't want to let people creep into the problem. Anticipate counterpoints, raise them, and show the justification resolution. So you may see that in something where warranty recovery decisions were made based on rework at the plant or something. You may look at that and say, I recognize the fact that some of our audience may not see the benefit on the dollar side of that, given decisions that we're going to have to ramp up and put in a new line for rework. And don't use the but, and say, and we also recognize that strategically we're positioning for aftermarket to take advantage of that. It'll take a while to get there, and we're considering that in our strategic initiatives. So use an and word, not a but, and anticipate those counterpoints. Use objective criteria to justify and promote the result, the decision. That objective criteria is the 1 + 1 = 2 kind of stuff. It's you can't argue with it kind of stuff. The data says what the data says. Of course, you don't want to be indignant about the way you present that. You want to create win-win scenarios. To say, I win, you win, everybody wins. The enterprises win, society as a whole wins. Everybody's a winner. Everybody gets something out of it. Then we talk about persuasion. And I would be remiss if I didn't include in here persuasion, because as I said earlier, just some people will argue that every presentation is a persuasive presentation, and I'm in agreement with them on that. There was some interesting decision theory documentation that I came along because I do a workshop on decision theory. And in there they talked about highly regarded, globally respected people working in the area of neurobiology, neuroscience, come back to say that given our ability to be able to track the way the brain works and consciousness works, we've come to the conclusion that just about every presentation, every decision made is coming from a foundation in emotions. So we need to take that into consideration. But here's how it works. Internal realization of our external world. We internalize the external world through these three primary senses: visual, auditory, kinesthetic. Kinesthetic is that touchy-feely. It's the emotional switch-up part of it. And we know that advertisers do that really well. They play the emotional card on us all the time. If you Google up, just, if you're up for game and you just want to be entertained, Google up how advertisers persuade us, and you'll discover that they're playing that to the kinesthetic side all the time. They're triggering emotions in us because they know that those emotions will short-circuit our cognitive frontal lobes. So when we look at visual, auditory, or kinesthetic, there's typically an order. So just to expand on that a little bit, if you're going to buy a car and you went to a used car dealer, chances are the guy's going to try to play you. He's going to want to sell a car and get his commission. He knows that you buy a car based on these three internalizations: visual, auditory, kinesthetic. What he doesn't know is the order. The order is important. And if he can figure out what the order is, then he can play it back to you and sell you a car. So he's going to ask questions like, you might look at the car you're driving and say, just out of curiosity, what made you buy that car? And you may say, man, I just love the way that car, I love the lines on it. Well, now he's got number one. He knows you're a visual guy. And then he's going to ask you, well, what else about that car really appealed to you? And you might say, oh, well, it was just the way it sounds. It's got a nice growl to it. I like the way the doors sound when they slam. You slam the trunk and it's got a deep thud. And, he might probe for that. Once he knows that combination of visual, then auditory, then kinesthetic, it wouldn't matter if you had orange crates in there for seats. It wouldn't matter if the dashboard was made out of burlap. He knows that if he can play that visual and that auditory back to you in that sequence, that the kinesthetic isn't playing very well in the equation at all. So every time you buy something, it's different. If you're buying a piece of furniture for the living room, it might be kinesthetic, auditory, visual. If you're buying a refrigerator, it might be visual, kinesthetic, auditory. It changes from one to the other. So what you want to do, now you're thinking, I know, then you want to play that back in every possible way that you could, because you're trying to encourage or persuade your audience. So you're looking to persuade them by figuring out which is the order that needs to be played back. Or you play it back in all three orders. If you play it visual, auditory, and then play it auditory, visual, maybe throw kinesthetic in, you can't play them all. But you can play the ones that you think are the most dominant. You're going to capture the vast majority of your audience with your ability to be able to reach your technical objectives. And of course, the objective statement at the bottom would be to structure the delivery to cover those variants. And it's dependent on the content, people-centric, data-centric, depends on what you're trying to accomplish. And as a reliability engineer, again, I would be remiss if I didn't bring you into this knowledge of how probabilities work when it comes to decision making. People are making decisions based on the information you give. We talked about that early in the presentation, that as you pump stuff out, they're deciding whether they're going to believe it, they're deciding whether they're going to take action, they're deciding whether they're going to do anything, they're deciding whether they're going to know what you're trying to get them to know. When we look at the probability weighting and the decision weighting, we would probably assume, well, they're about the same. If the probability is 1 in 10, then the decision weighting factor is probably the same, and that's not necessarily true. What we discover is that when the probability weighting is low, then the decision is being influenced significantly in a different way. So for small probabilities, we tend to be too optimistic, and that's the opposite is true on the other end. At this end of the scale, we tend to be a little more pessimistic. So when we throw the numbers at this thing and we look at what people do decision-wise, we can see that decision weighting and lower probabilities, chances are that it's a 1 in 10 million, that the decision maker is probably weighting that a lot more than the probability. At the other end, probably going the other way. Take, for example, typical lottery mentality. The probability is extremely low that you're going to win the lottery, yet the expectation is high. The kind of the Dunning-Kruger effect, if you're familiar with it, overconfident behavior. So people will buy the lottery tickets in spite of the fact that it's like, I think the lottery is like maybe 1 in 170 million or something. It doesn't stop you from buying a ticket. And if you're familiar with probabilities, then you should be familiar with maybe some benchmarks on probability. I'll give you one. The probability of becoming a president of the United States is 1 in 10 million. So if you throw your hat into the ring, there's a 1 in 10 million chance that you could actually become president of the United States. But yet, if you were going to lay money on the counter to buy a lottery ticket, it's a 1 in 173 million. And then if we just look at some other odds, when we look at decision theory and stuff like that, come to the abrupt realization that money's better spent somewhere else. Now, you may be asking the question, well, what about the second scenario, the pessimistic one? So in the second scenario, it's a pessimistic view. They take, for instance, health issues. Even though the probability is high, the likely in producing, the defined consequence, the decision weighting is low compared. So let's say somebody wanted to become healthier. So their objective, their goal is to become healthier. Well, they know that if they do physical exercise and start to embark on a healthy diet, that's going to help them. But yet the decision factor is probably weighted below the probability. So there's a high probability that you're going to be healthier if you eat healthy and if you exercise. Yet people refuse to do that because the decision weight rating is factored on something else. The decision is triggered by emotions, and so that sort of short circuits the probability rationalization. So you have to take that into consideration in your presentations also. I wanted to give you this lateral thinking as a guide as you navigate through your presentation material. And I realize we just focused on technical presentation skills, but nonetheless, it's wide open as to where you may find these presentation skills applicable. We just happen to focus on technical presentation skills. So evidence and or data that substantiates the proposal or the conclusion. We're looking at that. We're looking to put that in to this presentation. The contributing factors that will make this proposal or decision a success. We're going through that thought process with ourselves or with our team, and we're making a list and saying what kind of factors are going to make this thing work. And then you're also going to have to look at the other side of it and say, what can go wrong here that'll make this thing fail miserably? And then list those. Then you want to talk about the general feelings of the audience, or, you know, given the issue that they're being confronted with. What are the general feelings? And there are always feelings. And then creative ways in which you can deal with these issues that you've managed to conjure out of this field. So you want to take those in. And again, we're just giving you some thought process to help you navigate through the presentation material and how you construct it. We also have to take into consideration some of these biases and heuristics. Again, we make thousands, not tens of thousands of decisions every day. You get up and you have to decide, am I going to punch that snooze button or not? You have to decide whether you're going to go to the kitchen or go to the bathroom. First, you have to decide whether you're going to wear the red tie or the blue tie. You have to decide decision after decision as you're rolling down the driveway. You're going to look behind you, or you're going to roll through that stop sign at the end of the street, or you're going to pump the brake and make a complete stop. All of these decisions a lot of times are made even below your conscious level. There are a lot of times where you'll drive back and forth to work, same pattern every day, and then somebody will ask you, hey, did you notice that the church on the corner of 5th and Sycamore burnt down? You go, no, I drive through there every day, didn't notice it. No, because you're relying on these heuristics to just navigate you through. It's like you're not even thinking anymore. You don't even notice things around you. Other people do that too. So I take that into consideration. So use examples that have universal applicability, like human experiences that are culturally and geographically common. Use those instead of some local, geographically or tribally grown one. Selections of color schemes can also be significant. Be mindful of that. For instance, red represents mourning in South Africa, but in Chinese it represents good fortune. So maybe at the end of the day, your presentation is going to be black and white, unless you're trying to persuade somebody, like in advertisements when they try to persuade us. You go into the grocery store, you see lots of reds and yellows, because those are influencers at the emotional level. Take into consideration background independence. No baseline consideration or emotional stimulus. People don't have an understanding of what the baseline is. You may want to bring them into an awareness of what the baseline is. And then avoid using the word but, which we've already talked about. And likely the attribute is that but tends to negate everything in front of it. And then we got one more slide before we hit the end and look at some questions. We got a process flow and responsibilities hierarchy. We talk about the decision. This comes out of the decision workshops that I do. We talk about how do people categorize their thought. Well, it's an opinion, belief, knowledge, or maybe sometimes it's in denial. So we're looking at the objective, and then we're looking at a decision that's coming out of this context, and they're looking at the perception. So this material that we're giving them is already going to be screened with perception, depending on what the order of this is. And then they're going to get to a decision. We have also all these cognitive biases and heuristics that play into it. And we also have a predisposition to risk aversion or risk seeking. So all of this has to come in to the process that we're taking in order to deliver content to our audience. So when we talk about cognition, we would say, well, in your particular decision-making process, what level of cognition do you practice? Cognitive effort is taxing, makes you mentally exhausted, and you're conditioned on a daily basis to avert it. And we know this. I remember when I was a technician and I was just getting my double E degree. As a technician, I was all over the place. I was working with my hands. I was delivering things back and forth. And I remember walking by an electrical engineer and looking at him and making a comment and going, man, Tony, you got it easy, man. You sit at that drawing board all day. I'm running around like a maniac. He looked at me with this look of astonishment. He said, you have no idea what I'm doing here. He says, the work I'm doing here is much more taxing than the work that you're doing. At the end of the day, he was cognitively exhausted, which just sapped the energy right out of him. He was in much worse condition than I was at the end of the day, given my worst day. So I've taken into consideration that people don't want to spend the cognitive effort in order to come to a conclusion. They're looking for you to bring them to that conclusion. And then this risk-averse, risk-seeking, these people are in the audience. You know who they are. They may be risk-averse, they may be risk-seeking. In some cases, you may be looking to play that card, to say that if you know the chief financial officer is the decision maker and you know that this is a risky guy and that he's already gone bankrupt 3 times and he's okay with that, you may play the risk card to say that, hey, we're moving into a risky situation, or on the other side, you may find that the decision maker is risk averse, so you're going to play to that side. And I think rather than go into any more stories or examples of how that happens, for the benefit of time, so that we got a few minutes for discussion, maybe we'll look at reflections and comments. We started at a few minutes after 7. It's a few minutes after 8. I can't see the question panel, so I'm going to have to rely on my host to pose any questions that might have popped up.
Thanks, Dave. That was a great presentation, and I really like the way, you know, it kind of crescendoed up towards the finish with some of the different perceptions that people have. So what I'll do is I'll give the folks a minute or two to type any questions into the chat box. I do have a couple questions I wrote down for you myself, if you don't mind if I start with those.
You're free.
The first question I have, I mean, this is a great topic. I remember when I first reached out to you, I was quite impressed, and I thought this was a good topic because Volvo is a really diverse company. And I know you've worked in several other businesses as well. But what inspired you to develop the content for this presentation?
Well, it was even before I got to Volvo. But then again, when I got to Volvo, and they didn't have any training on cultural interaction, it surprised me because there's such a globally dispersed and culturally diverse organization. And so I was finding my way through it. And I went back to Volvo Group University and tried to get them to put something together that would be meaningful in that sense, especially when it came to presentations. They took the bait. You know, they've made some progress in that area. But then even looking, like I said earlier, going to Google and looking to see, well, what lessons have I learned the hard way and which ones did other people learn? And I look at that, and I even see in Harvard Business Review, they didn't really give it a good treatment. You know, they say the things that you would tell people in a Western-centric, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant group of people, where you would tell them, here are the things you should do if you're doing public presentations and public speaking. And I thought, my gosh, you know, for the Harvard Review to have that lingering without any culturally significant elements in it, I was kind of dismayed. So that's why I put it together, because I felt it's just missing. It's not something you can easily Google up and get. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, it did. I know you went over a couple different things that you should not do because they represent different things in other, you know, cultures. Is there any situations, perhaps unknowingly, you did something that you may have misrepresented yourself when traveling abroad or having different students in one of your classes?
Oh yeah, I do it all the time. You'd like to think that, wow, gee, you know, this guy, he delivers presentation skills, and yet he makes mistakes himself. Yeah. I get trumped by my emotions also, so it happens at just about every level. And you know, it's a constant effort. It's not that you ever get to the point where you're premier. I mean, you might think you are, but you can still slip up. I remember once when I worked for a big company up in upstate New York, and we spent, because we were doing a conference and we were doing it in a convention center, and so we were packing that place out. And we had deep pockets at the time, so we went and spent, I think, $20,000 on a keynote speaker that we picked off of the Washington Speakers Bureau. And I was kind of hosting the guy. I was running a committee that was supposed to bring this guy in. And, of course, I was doing some technical presentation skills for conference presenters. We were trying to bring engineers and scientists in that never did presentations before and get them to share their ideas. And we brought this guy in, and we had a phone call with him, and we ran him through a rehearsal to say, you know, here's our objective, here's what we want you to do, and we're paying you a lot of money to do it, and so we don't want you to stray off of it. And I remember sitting at the head table as he was getting introduced, and he was pulling some notes out of his pocket, and I leaned over and I said, what's that? And he goes, I had a couple of stories I wanted to share with the audience. He said, I was just looking at my notes. I'm going, no, it's not going to play well. I said, don't do that. Well, needless to say, he got up there and he started to share a story. And I mean, we had probably 4,000 people in the audience. I mean, we had a big audience there, and it was a big company. And he started to share a story that started out something like, I had a room on the 4th floor of the hotel, and I was looking down into the hot tub where the stewardesses were. It's like, well, man, the train was coming right off the tracks. After he told that story, I could see that the people representing HR got up and walked out, and of course we had to go and chase them down because we knew what the issue was. It was inappropriate. So not only do I make mistakes, but people who are, you're paying $20K for this guy to come in and do a keynote, and he's tripping over his own shoelaces too. So you never really arrive. You just keep on scrutinizing yourself, and practice does help. You can go through and you got to tell yourself, I'm not going to stray. I'm not going to go on a tangent. But every now and then the emotions get triggered and you go, yeah, I just feel compelled. I got to share this. So it happens.
Excellent. That's a great story. Dave, got our first question in from our colleague Nick Cooper here. And this is a good question, especially due to the social distancing that's going on here. He says, when pitching ideas to an international decision makers, is it possible to judge their knowledge level of the audience without ever meeting them face to face?
Yeah, that is a good question. And when we talk about knowledge level, that could be technical knowledge or it could be person knowledge. I think it's important to know who your audience is. So if you have the benefit of knowing who's going to be present in your presentation, you can always fact check them or background check them. And I do that quite a bit myself, where, especially on LinkedIn, if somebody comes to me and wants to be part of my LinkedIn, want me to share them, and, you know, I might go and look and see who are they, where do they work, what's their background look like, just to get a better idea of who they are. I just recently took a new boss, came out of a Volvo bus, and so I went and looked this guy up. You know, who is this guy? What's he doing? And so then you look at his profile and you go, oh yeah, so I see that he's done a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and I see presentations that he's done in the past, and I start to get a feel for who this guy is. And I fully expect that when he comes on board, that I'm going to see that stuff. I've seen it in the past. This was his agenda in bus. He's probably going to bring that agenda with him. I don't expect that he's going to change horses. He is who he is. So I think it's just knowing your audience. If you're going to play to an individual or a discipline or a particular objective, you'll want to do a little bit of homework on the front end before you go into it. I hope that helps.
Yep. Yeah, that's a great response, and that's especially important. You know, the internet is so accessible to a lot of people now, and there's some great tools out there, and it's really important. I want to add one thing to what you said, is to try to get an emotional, you know, some type of emotional response from your audience. And I think with the content that's online, you can kind of see what people are interested in, what they're all about.
Yeah, well, emotions are a really great hook. I mean, there's a lot of good movies out there that talk about that in their plots. You know, there was one I just watched recently was talked about that, and in there, in the plot of the movie, they were talking about how to hook people, and so they were trying to figure out how to put the right emotional hooks in. And when we look at advertising, again, it's just you know, if you're dying for entertainment, you're sick of watching cable TV, which I got rid of it. And so for entertainment now, I'll just do a search on YouTube. You just do a search up on how advertisers play us. I mean, you'll come away with a whole new respect for how it is you may be able to actually influence other people.
Yep, excellent. I don't see any other questions in, Dave. It's a well-delivered presentation. We've had almost 50 people call in for it. I really want to thank you for delivering this topic this evening. There are quite a few local folks from our local ASQ section. I want to thank everybody for calling in tonight. It was a good event, a good experience. And what I'll do, Dave, is I'll reach out to you separately for your address and mailing information. And what we'll do is we'll send you a small gift of appreciation on behalf of the ASQ Inspection Division.
Well, thanks. That's a nice surprise.
All right. With that being said, and no other further questions coming in, I wish everyone a good night. And Dave, if you have any other questions or anything, you know, we can chat afterwards. I will take back the present, you know, the event back at this point now. And then what I'll do is I'll make sure that we upload the presentation afterwards.
Very good. Thanks.
All right. Thank you very much, Dave. Have a good night, everyone.